When people imagine medieval life, they picture mud-caked boots, aching backs, and the endless toll of church bells. What they rarely imagine is what happened after dark, behind wooden doors, beneath straw mattresses, in homes where faith, fear, and survival shared the same narrow space. For medieval peasants, marriage was not a romance, it was an obligation. And intimacy was never just private, it was watched over by God, judged by neighbors, and regulated by rules few dared to question openly. In villages where hunger arrived with winter and death was never far, the bond between husband and wife carried enormous weight. Their closeness was believed to influence harvests, health, and even the favor of heaven itself. A poorly timed night could invite misfortune. A forbidden one could stain a soul forever. Yet, despite sermons and strict church laws, peasants developed their own quiet customs, rituals whispered by midwives, traditions passed between mothers and daughters, beliefs rooted in older worlds the church could never fully erase. This is not a tale of indulgence, but of humanity, of ordinary people navigating married life under extraordinary pressure, of love constrained by doctrine, desire shaped by superstition, and intimacy transformed into duty. To understand medieval peasants, we must step into their homes and listen carefully to what history only hints at.
In a medieval village, marriage was rarely a personal choice. For peasants, it was an economic contract shaped by land, labor, and lineage. Love, as later centuries would imagine it, came second, if it came at all. Most peasant marriages were arranged with the quiet approval of families and landlords. A man needed a wife to manage the household, tend animals, and bear children who would one day work the fields. A woman needed a husband for protection, legal standing, and survival. Alone, either faced poverty. Together, they had a chance. The wedding itself was often simple, a short ceremony near the church door, a blessing spoken aloud, and a public acknowledgement that two lives had been bound. But what followed mattered far more than the vows. From that moment on, a couple's private life became a matter of public interest, especially their ability to produce children. In medieval thought, a marriage was not considered complete until it was fulfilled. This fulfillment was not described openly, but everyone understood its meaning. Church authorities taught that intimacy within marriage was permitted only under strict conditions. It was not for pleasure, it was for procreation. Any closeness beyond that narrow purpose invited moral suspicion. Peasant couples lived with these teachings constantly. Sermons warned them that excessive affection weakened the soul. Confession manuals listed forbidden times for marital closeness, Sundays, holy days, fasting periods, and entire seasons like Lent. By some estimates, nearly half the year was off limits. Yet life did not pause for doctrine. A newly married couple often shared a single-room cottage with children, animals, and sometimes extended family. Privacy barely existed. Their bed, usually straw-stuffed and placed near the hearth, was both a place of rest and responsibility. The expectation to conceive came quickly. If no child arrived within a year or two, whispers began. Blame almost always fell on the woman. Midwives and village elders offered advice rooted in folk belief rather than church teaching. Certain foods were said to strengthen the body. Certain days were believed to bring good fortune. Phases of the moon mattered, so did the seasons. Spring was favored, winter was feared. For the husband, marital life carried its own burdens. He was taught that restraint was virtuous, yet failure to produce heirs could be seen as weakness. A man who could not lead his household was quietly judged. Masculinity in the medieval village was measured not by tenderness, but by results. Despite these pressures, affection did exist. Court records and personal letters, rare but revealing, suggest that many couples formed deep bonds over time. Shared labor created trust. Surviving illness and famine together forged connection. In those moments, closeness became something more than duty, even if it was never spoken of openly. But the church was always present, even in silence. Priests reminded couples that their bodies belonged to God. Confession forced peasants to account for their private lives in humiliating detail, using vague language that still carried heavy shame. To admit too much was dangerous. To admit too little was a sin. This constant tension shaped how intimacy was understood. It was not spontaneous, it was cautious, often ritualized. Some couples prayed beforehand, others avoided eye contact, believing modesty preserved moral order. Pleasure was something to be endured or ignored, never acknowledged. Yet beneath this restraint flowed older beliefs. Long before Christianity dominated Europe, rural communities had their own understanding of fertility and union. Echoes of these beliefs survived quietly. A piece of iron placed beneath the bed for strength, a ribbon tied at the foot of the mattress to ward off misfortune. Simple gestures that blended pagan memory with Christian fear. These practices were never written down. They were passed in whispers from elder women to young brides. The church condemned them when discovered, calling them superstition. But in villages far from cities, enforcement was uneven. Survival mattered more than purity. For medieval peasants, married life existed in a narrow space between obedience and instinct. Every shared night carried weight, not just personal, but cosmic. A child meant hope, a failure meant anxiety. And through it all, intimacy remained something both deeply human and deeply controlled. This was only the beginning of their story.
For medieval peasants, time was not measured by calendars alone. It was measured by bell tolls, seasons, and, most anxiously, by the absence or arrival of a child. From the moment a couple married, an invisible clock began to tick. Every passing month without pregnancy tightened the weight on their household. Fertility was not understood as biology. It was understood as fortune. If a woman conceived quickly, the village saw it as a sign of divine approval. If she did not, suspicion crept in quietly. People rarely accused outright, but glances lingered. Advice arrived unasked. Mothers-in-law watched closely. Even the priest might offer pointed reminders during confession. A barren marriage threatened more than pride. Children were labor. They carried water, scared birds from crops, cared for animals, and eventually replaced aging parents in the fields. Without children, survival in old age became uncertain. Fear of loneliness and poverty haunted childless couples more than any sermon. Women bore the heaviest burden. Medieval medicine, drawn from ancient texts and superstition, placed responsibility for fertility largely on the female body. A woman's internal balance was believed fragile, easily disrupted by cold, emotion, or improper behavior. If conception failed, remedies followed. Midwives were central figures in this world. They were not merely birth attendants, they were keepers of knowledge passed down through generations. Some of that knowledge came from experience, some from belief. To the church, this made them dangerous. A midwife might advise warm baths infused with herbs to prepare the body. She might recommend certain foods, eggs, honey, wine diluted with water, believed to encourage fruitfulness. She might whisper that certain nights, guided by the moon, carried greater promise than others. None of this appeared in official doctrine. Church authorities insisted that conception occurred only by God's will. Any attempt to influence it through rituals was condemned as superstition or worse, witchcraft. Yet in villages where infant mortality was high and hunger never far, peasants were unwilling to leave everything to chance. Some couples turned their bedroom into a quiet battleground between faith and fear. Before sharing closeness, prayers were common. A husband might cross himself. A wife might silently recite a psalm taught by her mother. These acts were not romantic, they were protective. Every gesture was meant to align the moment with divine favor. Yet alongside prayer lived ritual. A loaf of bread placed near the bed symbolized abundance. A knife hidden beneath straw was believed to ward off unseen harm. These objects were never discussed openly. If asked, peasants would deny their meaning. But they appeared again and again in court records when midwives or neighbors were questioned. The fear of doing something wrong extended beyond objects and timing. Emotional state mattered. Excessive affection was believed to weaken conception. Too much coldness could block it entirely. Balance, peasants believed, was everything. For men, fertility anxiety manifested differently. A husband was expected to lead his household with quiet authority. Failure to produce children threatened that authority. Some men sought advice from other men, farmers, elders, even traveling healers who offered cures for imagined weakness. These cures were rarely physical in the modern sense. They focused on rest, diet, and avoidance of sinful thoughts. A man's moral strength was believed directly tied to his ability to father children. Guilt, stress, and fear were thought to sap vitality. This belief created silence. Couples rarely spoke honestly about their worries. To admit fear was to invite judgment. Instead, tension settled into the household like smoke. Nights became scheduled rather than spontaneous. Each shared moment carried expectation instead of comfort. When a pregnancy finally occurred, relief spread quickly. The woman's status improved overnight. Her body was no longer suspicious, it was proven. Neighbors offered help. Elders nodded approvingly. Even the priest's tone softened. But pregnancy brought its own anxieties. Miscarriage was common, yet poorly understood. When it happened, blame returned swiftly. Had the couple been careless? Had the woman angered God? Had some unseen rule been broken? In the absence of medical explanation, morality filled the gap. Some women turned inward, believing themselves cursed. Others clung more tightly to ritual. A few quietly rejected both church and tradition, trusting only in time. These women rarely left records, but echoes of their defiance appear in testimonies where they refused midwives' advice or ignored fasting rules. The church's response was control. Confession manuals from the period asked detailed questions about married life, not for curiosity, but for correction. Priests were instructed to guide couples back toward proper conduct. Yet even these manuals acknowledged reality. Peasants struggled to follow every rule. In truth, fertility shaped intimacy more than belief ever could. Desire, when it appeared, was quickly overshadowed by calculation. Hope replaced passion. Fear replaced comfort. Still, within this pressure, bonds formed. Some couples learned to find closeness in shared hardship rather than expectation. They spoke softly at night. They held hands during long walks to fields. In these moments, intimacy existed beyond doctrine, even if unacknowledged. By the time a first child arrived, or failed to, the couple had already been transformed. Marriage was no longer theoretical, it was tested. In a medieval village, privacy was a fragile illusion. Homes were small, walls were thin, and lives were lived in close proximity. Everyone knew when a cow gave birth, when a field failed, and more quietly when a marriage did not unfold as expected. For peasant couples, the boundary between private life and public scrutiny was nearly non-existent. Marriage was not just a union between two people, it was a social contract monitored by the entire community. Neighbors paid attention to details modern minds might overlook. How long after the wedding before a child appeared, whether a couple shared meals peacefully, if a husband slept elsewhere, if a wife attended church alone too often. These observations were not driven by cruelty, but by fear. An unstable household threatened the balance of the village. When suspicion arose, it rarely exploded at once. It seeped. An elder woman might comment on a wife's appearance. A neighbor might ask an innocent-sounding question about health. Over time, these remarks formed a quiet investigation. If answers did not satisfy, the matter could move beyond gossip into the reach of the church. Church courts were not distant institutions. They were local, familiar, and feared. Priests and officials summoned ordinary peasants to answer questions about their lives. These courts handled disputes over marriage, morality, and conduct, and they took marital obligations seriously. If a husband was accused of neglecting his marital duty, he could be questioned publicly. If a wife was suspected of resisting or failing in her role, she too could be summoned. The language used was careful, but the meaning was unmistakable. Records from these courts reveal a striking pattern. Intimate matters were discussed using indirect phrasing. Words like proper conduct, marital obligation, and natural duty appeared repeatedly. Everyone involved understood what was being referenced, even if no one named it outright. The humiliation was real. Imagine standing before your neighbors while a church official asked whether you had fulfilled your responsibilities as a spouse. Imagine being forced to defend not only your behavior, but your body, your health, and your faith all at once. For peasants, this was not hypothetical. It happened regularly. Women suffered most under this scrutiny. If a marriage remained childless, the wife was often accused of withholding herself or behaving improperly. In some cases, she was ordered to submit more willingly to her husband, as defined by church standards. Consent, as understood today, did not exist in this framework. Duty outweighed personal comfort. Men were not immune. A husband accused of neglect could be fined, shamed, or instructed to change his behavior under threat of further punishment. In extreme cases, prolonged failure to fulfill marital expectations could be grounds for annulment, rare but devastating. The village watched these proceedings closely. Public trials reinforced social norms. They reminded everyone what was expected behind closed doors. Even couples never summoned to court felt the pressure. Fear of exposure shaped behavior more powerfully than belief alone. Yet not all scrutiny came from the church. Older villagers, especially widows and midwives, held informal authority. They noticed patterns others missed. They intervened quietly, offering guidance or warning. Their advice was often practical, rooted in experience rather than doctrine. In many ways, they controlled the village's moral rhythm more than priests did. A young wife might be told to behave with greater patience. A husband might be advised to show firmness. These conversations happened near ovens, wells, and fields, never in writing, always in whispers. Despite the constant surveillance, peasants found ways to reclaim small spaces of autonomy. Some couples developed routines that avoided attention. Others cultivated reputations for piety to shield themselves from suspicion. A well-timed donation to the church or visible attendance at services could soften judgment. There were also acts of quiet resistance. Court records include cases where couples contradicted official expectations. Some women argued that their health prevented certain obligations. Some men claimed exhaustion or injury. These defenses were risky, but occasionally successful. When accepted, they revealed cracks in the system, moments where lived reality overpowered rigid doctrine. Shame, however, lingered. Once accused, a couple rarely returned to full social comfort. Whispers followed them. Their actions were watched more closely. Their failures, real or imagined, became part of their identity. Yet within this pressure cooker, something unexpected sometimes emerged: solidarity. Husbands and wives who endured public scrutiny together often grew closer. Facing judgment as a unit strengthened their bond. They learned to protect each other with silence, shared stories, and mutual understanding. These relationships did not resemble modern romance, but they were resilient. Built on survival rather than desire, they endured where idealized unions might not. By the late medieval period, some church officials began to recognize the harm caused by excessive intrusion. Manuals softened slightly. Penalties became more flexible. But the damage had already been done. Generations had grown up believing that even the most private aspects of life were subject to public approval. When the sun set over a medieval village, life did not become freer. In many ways, it became more restricted. Darkness brought silence, but it also brought rules, rules that followed peasant couples into their homes and even into their beds. Night was not simply a time for rest, it was a moral space, shaped by belief, fear, and constant self-surveillance. The church taught that the body was weakest at night. Temptation was believed to grow stronger in darkness, when supervision faded and thoughts wandered. For married couples, this meant that even lawful closeness required caution. Intimacy after sunset was permitted only within strict boundaries. Time mattered. Certain nights were considered acceptable, others were forbidden. Sundays were off limits, as they preceded holy worship. Fridays carried the memory of Christ's suffering and demanded restraint. Entire seasons, especially Lent and Advent, were marked by prolonged abstinence. Violating these rules was believed to invite spiritual and physical consequences. Peasants did not always agree with these teachings, but they respected their power. Many couples kept mental calendars, tracking days when closeness was allowed. This practice transformed marital life into a schedule rather than a shared impulse. Desire, when it appeared, had to wait. Discipline became a form of devotion. Yet folk belief layered additional meaning onto the night. The moon was watched carefully. A full moon was thought to strengthen the body and encourage fertility. A waning moon carried risk. Some couples avoided closeness entirely during certain phases, fearing it could result in illness or misfortune. These beliefs predated Christianity, but they survived quietly in rural life. The bed itself held symbolic importance. Most peasant beds were simple wooden frames filled with straw or hay. They were uncomfortable by modern standards, but deeply meaningful. This space represented continuity, where children were conceived, born, and sometimes died. It was not a place of indulgence, it was a threshold between life and uncertainty. Before settling in for the night, small rituals occurred. Some couples prayed together. Others performed gestures taught by elders, crossing themselves, placing objects near the bed, or arranging blankets in a specific way. These acts were meant to protect against unseen forces believed to roam in darkness. Silence was valued. Peasant homes were crowded, often housing multiple generations and animals. Privacy was scarce. Conversations at night were whispered or avoided altogether. many couples communicated through habit rather than words. This silence shaped how closeness was experienced, restrained, careful, and inward. Despite these constraints, night was still the only time intimacy could occur. Daylight was filled with labor. Bodies were exhausted by sunset. For many couples, fatigue dulled desire, turning marital obligation into something endured rather than sought. Church writers criticized this exhaustion, claiming it led to improper behavior, but they offered no solution. In some cases, fatigue fostered tenderness. A husband returning from the fields with aching muscles, a wife whose hands were cracked from labor. In these moments, closeness became less about expectation and more about comfort. These moments rarely left records, but they shaped real lives. Fear, however, remained constant. Peasants believed that improper behavior at night could anger God or invite supernatural harm. Illness, crop failure, or infant death were often blamed on moral lapses. This belief placed enormous pressure on couples to interpret every misfortune as a consequence of unseen errors. Women internalized this fear deeply. If a child was born weak or sick, mothers often blamed themselves for imagined mistakes during pregnancy or before it. Had they been careless? Had they failed to follow a rule they barely understood? Guilt settled heavily, reinforced by sermons and community judgment. Men carried a different anxiety. A husband was expected to maintain order, not only in the household, but in behavior. If misfortune struck, he questioned his leadership. Had he failed to guide his wife properly? Had he allowed indulgence where restraint was required? These questions were rarely voiced, but they shaped identity. Occasionally, couples broke the rules deliberately. These acts were quiet and rare. A shared moment on a forbidden night, a choice made out of longing rather than obligation. Such decisions carried risk, but they also affirmed humanity. These moments were not rebellious in a modern sense. They were survival of the spirit. Church authorities knew such breaches occurred. Confession manuals asked priests to listen carefully for signs of disobedience. Penances were assigned accordingly: fasting, prayer, public acknowledgement. Yet enforcement varied. In remote villages, priests often turned a blind eye, understanding the limits of control. Over time, a gap grew between doctrine and practice. Peasants learned to navigate this gap carefully. They followed enough rules to avoid punishment, while quietly adapting others to fit their lives. This negotiation shaped marital intimacy into something uniquely medieval, neither free nor fully constrained. The night, then, was not a space of freedom, but of calculation. Every action carried meaning. Every choice echoed beyond the bed into the fields, the church, and the future. In the medieval peasant world, pregnancy changed everything. The moment a woman was believed to be carrying a child, her body took on a new and unsettling status. It was honored, feared, protected, and controlled all at once. What had once been a private marital matter became a concern shared by the entire village. Pregnancy was seen as proof of divine favor. A woman who conceived fulfilled her primary social role. Neighbors congratulated her. Elders offered blessings. Even the church, which so often spoke in warnings, softened its tone. Her body was no longer suspect, it was productive. This shift in perception brought temporary relief from judgment. But it also brought new restrictions. Medieval belief held that a pregnant body was fragile and unpredictable. Too much physical strain could harm the unborn child. Strong emotions were thought to leave marks on the baby's soul. Even certain thoughts were believed to influence development. As a result, a woman's behavior was closely monitored. Intimacy within marriage changed immediately. Church teachings advised restraint during pregnancy, not only for physical reasons, but moral ones. The act that had led to conception was now complete. Further closeness was often discouraged. For some couples, this meant months of distance. For others, it meant navigating conflicting advice from priests, midwives, and elders. Midwives played a critical role during this period. They were guardians of knowledge that men, priests included, did not possess. They advised women on diet, rest, and conduct. They also passed down warnings rooted in folk belief. Certain nights were considered dangerous. Certain positions during sleep were avoided. Certain objects were placed near the bed for protection. These practices existed in tension with church doctrine. While priests emphasized prayer and obedience, midwives emphasized balance and experience. Many women trusted midwives more than clergy, especially during pregnancy. This trust sometimes placed them at risk, as accusations of superstition or witchcraft often targeted midwives. For husbands, pregnancy altered authority. A man was still the head of the household, but his wife's condition limited his control. He was expected to protect her, provide extra care, and sometimes restrain his own expectations. Failure to do so could lead to blame if the pregnancy ended badly. This shift was subtle but significant. Some men struggled with the loss of routine. Others found relief in the temporary suspension of expectation. For couples who had lived under constant pressure to conceive, pregnancy offered a pause, a space to exist without immediate judgment. Yet fear replaced pressure. Childbirth was dangerous. Infant mortality was high. Women died in labor with alarming frequency. Every pregnancy carried the shadow of death. This knowledge shaped how couples interacted. Tenderness often increased, not out of romance, but out of awareness.
The female body became a site of contradiction. It was sacred because it carried life. It was dangerous because it could fail. Blood, in particular, was feared. Medieval thought linked blood to both life and corruption. A woman's bleeding during miscarriage or childbirth was seen as powerful and unsettling. This fear led to isolation. During late pregnancy and after childbirth, women were often separated from daily village life. They remained indoors. After birth, mothers underwent a period of ritual purification before returning to church. This practice, known as churching, symbolized both gratitude and reintegration. During this time, intimacy was suspended entirely. The separation reinforced the idea that a woman's body moved through phases of acceptability. Marital closeness was allowed only when the body was deemed proper. This belief stripped intimacy of spontaneity and tied it firmly to social approval. Yet within this structure, women found agency. Pregnancy allowed some women to assert boundaries they could not otherwise claim. They rested more, they avoided certain duties, they negotiated behavior using concern for the child as justification. These small shifts mattered. Childbirth itself was a communal event. Men were excluded. Women gathered to support the mother. Midwives directed the process. Prayers were spoken. Charms were used. This female-centered space stood apart from male authority and church oversight, existing briefly as its own world. If the birth succeeded, celebration followed. If it failed, silence often followed instead. Couples who lost children endured grief that had little space for expression. Mourning was brief by necessity. Life demanded continuation. Intimacy, when it returned, was shaped by loss rather than hope. Repeated pregnancies, repeated losses, this cycle defined many marriages. Over time, emotional distance sometimes grew. In other cases, shared grief deepened connection. Medieval records rarely capture these nuances, but their traces remain in patterns of behavior and belief. By the end of pregnancy and childbirth, intimacy was no longer what it had been.
It had been reshaped by fear, reverence, and survival. In the medieval peasant world, failure was never private. When a marriage did not produce children, when a pregnancy ended in miscarriage, or when an infant died, the consequences rippled far beyond the bedroom. Such moments were interpreted not only as misfortune, but as moral signals, signs that something in the household had gone astray. The village was always watching. Gossip traveled fast, and neighbors rarely hesitated to interpret tragedy as judgment. If a couple remained childless for years, whispers began about fault. Women were accused of coldness or failing to fulfill their duty. Men were suspected of weakness or neglect. These judgments were subtle but pervasive, affecting social standing and self-perception. Church authorities reinforced these ideas through doctrine and ritual. Confession manuals outlined questions designed to uncover hidden sins, asking whether couples had fulfilled their marital obligations in accordance with God's law. The questions were indirect, but their meaning was unmistakable. Couples were compelled to evaluate their most private moments under the lens of morality and divine approval. Fear permeated daily life. Every miscarriage was a reminder of the fragile boundary between obedience and failure. Every infant death reinforced the belief that mistakes, even unseen ones, had consequences. Some couples internalized guilt so deeply that they changed behavior for years, adjusting everything from timing to ritual to ensure no further transgression occurred. Midwives, while trusted, could become agents of moral enforcement. Their advice, once considered practical or protective, could later be interpreted as interference or superstition. Court records show women accused of manipulating fertility through charms, herbs, or timing, even when their intent was survival, not malice. A simple gesture, a ribbon placed near a bed, or a ritual whispered at night could be seen as meddling with divine order. Men faced pressure differently. Authority required results, and a failure to produce heirs could threaten social and economic stability. Some men responded with resignation, others with rigid enforcement of rules at home. Tension between marital duty and emotional reality defined daily interactions, shaping a life where intimacy became both expected and constrained. Yet peasants were not passive victims of doctrine or superstition. Within homes, couples navigated these pressures quietly. They adjusted schedules, consulted midwives, and developed private rituals. Some found comfort in small gestures, a hand held during a storm, a prayer shared before sleep, a meal prepared with care. These acts were never recorded officially, but they were the lifeblood of survival and connection. Blame often extended to external forces. Neighbors and clergy attributed misfortune to supernatural interference or divine punishment. Crops failing, livestock dying, or illness striking a household could be linked to marital missteps. In response, couples increased ritual observance, adjusting behavior according to what they believed would satisfy unseen powers. Life became a constant negotiation between fear and hope. Through all of this, intimacy survived in a transformed way. It was no longer an expression of desire. It was a calculated act of faith, survival, and obedience. Love, when it appeared, was quiet and measured. Human connection persisted in whispered words, shared labor, and small gestures of care. These moments were precious precisely because they existed under constraint. Even in the harshest circumstances, medieval peasants sought agency. A woman might choose the timing of her prayers. A man might offer comfort at night. Couples developed silent communication to navigate fear without attracting judgment. Through these small acts, the private life became a space of resilience rather than mere compliance. By understanding failure and blame in this context, we see why intimacy in the medieval peasant household was never just personal. Every choice was embedded in a web of social expectation, religious instruction, and survival necessity. Private life and public oversight were inseparable, shaping not just behavior, but identity.
Beyond the church's rules and the village's scrutiny, another layer of influence shaped the intimate lives of medieval peasants: superstition. Folk beliefs were woven into daily life, whispered from mother to daughter, and silently observed alongside official doctrine. For many couples, these customs were as important as prayer, sometimes more so, because they offered a sense of control in a world filled with uncertainty. Peasants believed that unseen forces influenced fertility, health, and prosperity. Marital closeness was not only a matter of obedience, but also a delicate negotiation with these forces. Timing, environment, and ritual all played roles in ensuring success or avoiding disaster. Certain days and nights were considered more favorable than others. A full moon might be preferred for conception, a waning moon avoided. Special feast days or saints' days could either invite fortune or danger, depending on local interpretation. Couples adjusted their lives accordingly, sometimes planning weeks ahead to align with these unseen rhythms. Objects carried symbolic weight. A charm placed beneath the bed, a sprig of a sacred herb, or even a loaf of bread set aside overnight was thought to influence outcome. These gestures were not frivolous. They represented centuries of observation, trial, and adaptation. While priests often condemned them as superstition, villagers continued to rely on them quietly, seeing them as complementary rather than contradictory to faith. Midwives were the main custodians of this knowledge. Their guidance extended beyond childbirth, encompassing household rituals, fertility advice, and even moral instruction. A midwife might instruct a young wife to sleep in a particular position or place a token near the crib. She might whisper prayers or charms that drew from pre-Christian traditions, carefully blending them with accepted Christian practices to avoid suspicion. Despite secrecy, these rituals shaped behavior profoundly. They gave structure to the household, creating routines that aligned with both superstition and church rules. For example, couples might follow strict abstinence on certain days while performing protective rituals on others, creating a rhythm of constraint and permitted intimacy. Even simple gestures carried meaning. A husband who returned home from the fields with a small offering for his wife, a flower, a pinch of grain, or a token from the market, was not only showing affection, but participating in a ritual believed to encourage fertility and goodwill. These acts were subtle, yet loaded with cultural significance. Superstition also addressed misfortune. If a pregnancy failed or a child fell ill, neighbors might suggest specific rituals to restore balance, sprinkling water from a sacred spring, burning certain herbs, or offering small gifts at the church. Couples performed these acts quietly, navigating a complex web of belief, morality, and necessity. Interestingly, superstition sometimes mitigated conflict. By offering explanations for misfortune outside personal blame, it allowed couples to maintain cohesion under stress. A failed harvest, a miscarriage, or illness could be attributed to forces beyond human control, rather than being a direct indictment of a husband or wife. Yet superstition could also amplify fear. Missteps, real or imagined, were thought to provoke spiritual retaliation. A poorly performed ritual, a forgotten charm, or missed sacred date could invite misfortune.
Couples walked a tightrope between compliance and error, guided by both fear and hope. Marriage, therefore, was a blend of obligation, ritual, and quiet rebellion. Within homes, couples navigated the expectations of the church, the judgment of neighbors, and the guidance of superstition. Intimacy existed within this framework, shaped as much by belief and ritual as by human desire. By understanding superstition in peasant life, we see how the invisible world governed visible behavior. It influenced timing, gestures, and daily routines. It structured nights, defined sacred spaces, and offered a sense of agency in a universe that otherwise offered little control.
In the medieval peasant village, authority was not limited to lords, priests, or kings. Much of daily life, especially marriage, fertility, and intimacy, was overseen by figures whose power was informal yet profound: midwives and village elders. They shaped behavior, guided customs, and ensured that the invisible rules of survival and propriety were followed. Midwives were the most influential of these figures. They were more than birth attendants. They were keepers of knowledge, interpreters of signs, and arbiters of local ritual. Their expertise extended far beyond the delivery room, influencing the timing of marital closeness, the care of pregnant women, and even the selection of ritual objects to ensure fertility and household stability. A midwife's advice could make or break a marriage. Couples often followed her guidance meticulously, viewing it as essential to success. She might recommend certain days for intimacy, herbs to strengthen the body, or prayers to ensure favor from God. Sometimes she acted as a mediator in disputes between husband and wife, offering strategies to navigate tension while maintaining social and spiritual propriety. Elders, especially older women, also wielded influence. Their authority was rooted in experience. They observed patterns, remembered past misfortunes, and shared wisdom passed down through generations. Their words carried weight because they were grounded in survival. They could warn a young wife about risky behaviors, advise on household management, or guide a husband in maintaining proper respect and care. These figures operated quietly but effectively. Their enforcement of custom often rivaled that of the church, particularly in remote villages. While priests dictated doctrine, midwives and elders dictated daily reality. They ensured that couples adhered to the rhythm of life dictated by superstition, ritual, and practical necessity. Marital life, therefore, was under constant supervision. Every stage, from courtship to pregnancy, childbirth, and parenting, was shaped by guidance and oversight. Couples internalized these expectations, often performing rituals or gestures without conscious thought, simply because they had been instructed to do so. Yet, midwives and elders were not merely enforcers. They offered a kind of protection. By teaching women how to manage pregnancy safely, how to navigate marital duties, and how to maintain social favor, they helped households survive. Their knowledge preserved life, reduced conflict, and provided a framework for negotiating the pressures of intimate life. This invisible authority also shaped emotional behavior. Couples learned when to show tenderness, when to exercise restraint, and how to maintain balance under constant observation. Their private actions, though technically their own, were deeply influenced by these figures. Even in moments of closeness, the shadow of guidance loomed. Interestingly, this system produced both conformity and subtle resistance. While couples generally followed instructions, they also developed private habits that allowed some personal agency. A shared glance, a whispered word, or a small gesture
could communicate affection or reassurance without violating social norms. These acts were carefully calibrated, blending personal desire with expectation. The authority of midwives and elders was not without tension. Church officials sometimes viewed their influence as dangerous. Folk rituals and secret practices were labeled superstition or heresy. Midwives could be accused of manipulating fertility, casting spells, or defying divine order. Yet their authority persisted because they were indispensable to survival. Without their guidance, many households could not endure the harsh realities of peasant life. By understanding the role of these women, we see why marital life in medieval peasant life was never purely private. It was shaped by overlapping systems of guidance, spiritual, social, and practical. Love, desire, and closeness existed within these structures, filtered through advice, oversight, and ritual.
In medieval peasant life, every aspect of existence was tied to the land. Fields dictated schedules, weather dictated survival, and the changing seasons dictated even the most intimate aspects of marriage. Husbands and wives were not free to act purely on desire. Their closeness was guided by the cycles of labor, fertility, and communal expectation. Spring brought hope and renewal. The fields needed planting, and every able body was required in the soil. Yet this season was also associated with fertility in folk belief. Midwives and elders often advised couples that spring nights were favorable for conception. This guidance was framed in practical and symbolic terms. Strength returned after winter, and the land itself seemed alive with possibility. Couples balanced exhaustion from labor with the silent pressure of opportunity, performing intimacy as both duty and ritual. Summer was relentless work. Crops required constant attention, water, and protection. Harvests loomed on the horizon, and the household ran on a tight schedule. Nights were short, beds often shared with children or animals, and private moments were scarce. For many couples, intimacy was minimized during these months, not out of moral obligation alone, but because survival demanded energy and focus. Autumn brought harvest and relief. When the fields were gathered and food stored, couples found fleeting windows of rest. Folk belief held that certain harvest festivals were auspicious for fertility, and couples sometimes followed these cues with care. These acts were quiet and understated, never discussed publicly, but they reflected the subtle integration of labor, ritual, and intimacy. Winter was the most dangerous season. Cold, hunger, and illness heightened the risks of pregnancy and childbirth. Church rules often extended fasting and abstinence, while superstitions warned against overexertion in marital life. Yet winter nights were long, and in the small warmth of a shared cottage, couples occasionally sought closeness, always measured, often ritualized, and never free from the shadow of fear. Throughout the year, the rhythm of labor dictated the rhythm of life. Fields, animals, and household duties framed every interaction. A husband's return from the fields brought exhaustion and sometimes relief from obligation. A wife's work in the home dictated timing, rest, and availability. Their lives were synchronized to external demands more than private desire. Folk festivals, feast days, and religious observances added another layer. Church calendars marked periods of abstinence, celebration, and ritual. Couples navigated these carefully, balancing desire with fear of sin. Even when regulations conflicted with practical life, such as during harvest, the weight of belief influenced behavior. Children also shaped seasonal rhythms. Pregnancy and nursing demanded adjustments to labor, sleep, and ritual observance. Families organized work around the needs of the vulnerable, blending duty with survival strategy.
Intimacy, always constrained, adapted to these pressures. Despite hardship, couples found small spaces of autonomy, shared meals, quiet moments by the hearth, whispered words during chores. These were the private signals of closeness, rarely documented but profoundly important. Even in the strictest observance of rules and superstition, human connection persisted. The seasons, then, were more than agricultural markers. They dictated rhythm, opportunity, risk, and reward. Labor and intimacy were intertwined, framed by necessity, belief, and survival. Understanding these cycles allows modern observers to see why medieval marriage was not just personal, but deeply social and practical.
As we step back from the daily lives of medieval peasants, the picture that emerges is one of complexity, resilience, and quiet ingenuity. Marriage and intimacy were never simple matters of desire or affection. They were profoundly shaped by labor, religion, superstition, and social scrutiny. Yet within these constraints, human connection endured. Couples navigated overlapping systems of expectation. The church dictated moral conduct. Elders and midwives guided practical survival. Neighbors observed compliance, and superstition offered both guidance and caution. Every action carried meaning. Every shared moment was filtered through the lenses of duty, fear, and hope. What we might perceive as repression or restriction today was, for them, survival and negotiation. Despite the constant oversight, medieval peasants were remarkably adaptive. They created private rituals, developed silent communication, and found tenderness in gestures that were socially acceptable but personally meaningful. A shared meal, a hand held during labor, a whispered word of comfort. These small acts preserved intimacy even under pressure. Human connection persisted quietly, often invisibly, but with profound significance. The life of a peasant couple was cyclical. Seasons, fertility, and labor dictated rhythms of closeness. Pregnancy and childbirth reshaped intimacy, emphasizing reverence, caution, and survival over desire. Failure and loss brought grief, but also opportunities for solidarity. Every challenge strengthened resilience, teaching couples how to navigate the intersection of personal needs and social expectation. Midwives and elders played crucial roles in this resilience. Their guidance preserved life, mediated conflict, and helped couples maintain balance within a restrictive framework. Even when their advice was labeled superstition or condemned by the church, it reflected centuries of accumulated experience, blending practical wisdom with ritualized care. Looking closer, the story of medieval peasant intimacy is not one of deprivation, but of adaptation. It reveals how ordinary people made meaning within constraint, how they negotiated fear and hope, and how human relationships endured under constant surveillance. Desire was never absent. It was measured, carefully expressed, and protected by ritual. Connection persisted, not in spite of constraint, but alongside it. The legacy of this period continues to resonate. Anthropologists and historians recognize the ways in which human behavior adjusts to social and environmental pressures. The medieval peasant household teaches us that intimacy is not merely private, it is a negotiation between duty, belief, and survival. Even when society imposes limits, human ingenuity finds ways to maintain connection, trust, and care. Finally, these stories remind us that intimacy has always been more than physical. It is emotional, social, and symbolic. It adapts to circumstance, thrives in ritual, and endures through hardship.
The peasants of medieval Europe may have lived under scrutiny, superstition, and scarcity, but their lives reveal a profound human truth. Even in the harshest conditions, people seek closeness, connection, and continuity. Theirs was a world of constraint, but also of ingenuity, adaptation, and quiet resilience. Their legacy is not found in the failures or fears imposed upon them, but in the subtle ways they preserved intimacy, negotiated survival, and maintained the bonds that define human life. Through their story, we glimpse the enduring human capacity to find connection, even when every external force seems to conspire against it.